High in the remote peaks of the Blue Ridge Mountains, 12-year-old Samuel had known nothing but poverty and his grandmother's love. When she passed, leaving him her crumbling cabin and a whispered promise that the walls remember everything, he thought it was just the rambling of a dying woman. But on his first night alone, sorting through her meager possessions, he found something that made his blood run cold. A hidden compartment behind the old wood stove, and inside it a leather satchel filled with documents that bore his grandmother's name, alongside words like heir and estate, and a sum of money so vast it seemed impossible. Why had she lived in such crushing poverty when she possessed a fortune? Who had kept this secret buried for decades? And why had someone just pulled into the overgrown driveway below? The cemetery sat on a wind-swept ridge above the valley, a small plot of weathered stones and wooden crosses that seemed to lean toward the earth, as if tired of standing. Samuel stood at the edge of the freshly dug grave, his worn boots sinking slightly into the soft red clay, his threadbare black jacket buttoned tight against the October chill that swept down from the high peaks. He was 12 years old, small for his age, with a lean face burned brown by the sun, and sharp blue eyes that held a quietness far beyond his years. Around him stood perhaps a dozen people, mountain folk who had known his grandmother Eliza, their faces carved by hard lives and honest work. The preacher, an elderly man with a voice like gravel rolling downhill, spoke words about dust and eternity, but Samuel heard them only as a distant murmur beneath the rushing of the wind through the bare oak trees. His grandmother had been his entire world, the only family he had ever known since his mother died, giving birth to him, and his father vanished into the hollows before he could walk. Eliza had raised him in a cabin so poor that winter winds whistled through the cracks, and summer heat pressed down through the tin roof like a weight. Yet she had filled that humble place with fierce love, and endless stories told by candlelight when they could not afford kerosene. Now she was gone, taken by a sickness that no amount of her herbal remedies could cure, and the boy felt as though the ground beneath him had turned to smoke. When the preacher finished and the few mourners began to drift away, with murmured condolences and gentle pats on his shoulder, a man in a rumpled brown suit approached him. This was Harold Perkins, the only lawyer within 30 miles, a tired-looking man with spectacles that sat crooked on his nose and a briefcase that had seen better decades. He spoke in a low, respectful tone, explaining that Eliza had left a will, simple and direct, bequeathing to Samuel her cabin, her land, and everything contained within. It was not much in the eyes of the law, Perkins admitted, just a few acres of rocky soil, and a structure that the county assessor had valued at nearly nothing, but it was Samuel's now, free and clear. The boy nodded, unable to find words, the reality of ownership meaning little when weighed against the enormity of his loss. Perkins handed him a key, though the cabin door had never had a working lock in Samuel's memory, and told him to come into town if he needed anything, though they both knew there was nothing the law could do for a boy whose only need was to have his grandmother back. Samuel walked home alone as the afternoon shadows lengthened across the mountain, following the narrow dirt path that wound through hollows thick with rhododendron and across a creek he had crossed 10,000 times at her side. When the cabin came into view, he stopped and stared at it, as if seeing it for the first time. It looked so small against the great blue ridges that rose behind it, so fragile and forgotten, a structure of logs and tin and old newspapers stuffed in the walls for insulation, with a porch that sagged and windows that no longer closed properly. Smoke should have been rising from the chimney at this hour, and he should have smelled beans cooking and cornbread baking, and he should have heard her voice calling him in before the dark came. But there was only silence, a silence so heavy it seemed to press against his chest and make it hard to breathe. He climbed the porch steps, each one groaning beneath his small weight, and pushed open the door. The cabin was cold and still, The wood stove dead and black, her rocking chair empty by the window, where she had spent her last days watching the light move across the hills. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, feeling the weight of his new solitude settle onto his shoulders like a yoke. He was alone now, truly alone, a boy of 12 with nothing but a crumbling cabin, a few acres of mountain land, and the memory of a woman who had loved him with everything she had. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him, and the sound of it latching echoed through the empty room, like the closing of a chapter in a book he was not ready to finish reading. Samuel was a small boy, wiry and lean in the way of mountain children who grow up on beans and cornbread, and whatever the garden and the woods provide, his frame seemingly constructed from sinew and determination rather than adequate nourishment. His hair was the color of chestnuts in autumn, perpetually unruly despite his grandmother's attempts to tame it with a wet comb each Sunday morning, and it fell across his forehead in a way that made him look younger than his 12 years until you saw his eyes. Those eyes were a sharp and startling blue, the color of the sky on a clear winter morning, and they held a depth of observation that unnerved some adults who expected children to be simple and easily read. His hands told the truer story of his life, small but thick with calluses across the palms and fingers, from years of chopping wood and hauling water and working the rocky garden plot, and doing all the countless tasks that survival in these remote mountains required. He had a scar on his left thumb from a hatchet that slipped when he was 9, and his knuckles were perpetually cracked and rough, and these were not the hands of a child who had known softness or leisure, but of one who understood that life demanded work and gave nothing freely. He moved through the cabin now in the grey light of morning, seeing it with eyes that were both intimately familiar and somehow strange, as if his grandmother's absence had shifted everything slightly out of true. The structure itself was old, built by hands long since turned to dust, its logs darkened by decades of wood smoke and weather to the color of deep coffee. The porch sagged on the left side, where the foundation stones had shifted, and the tin roof bore patches of rust that bloomed orange and red like strange flowers. Inside, the single main room served as kitchen and living space, with a small loft above where Samuel slept on a straw mattress that rustled with his every movement. The walls were papered with pages from old newspapers and magazines, layer upon layer applied over the years to block the drafts, and Samuel had spent countless hours reading those random fragments of news and advertisements from decades past. The wood stove squatted in the center of the room, like a cast-iron toad, cold now for the first time Samuel could remember, cold and dead, and waiting for a fire he could not yet bring himself to light. His grandmother's possessions remained exactly as she had left them, and each one carried a weight of memory that made them precious beyond any monetary value. Her rocking chair sat by the window, the wood worn smooth by years of sitting and rocking, and the indent of her body still seemed to hold the ghost of her presence. Her worn Bible lay on the small table beside it, its pages filled with her careful notations in the margins. A chipped ceramic cup sat beside it, still bearing a faint ring of herbal tea, and Samuel could not bring himself to wash it. But it was the photograph in the simple wooden frame on the shelf above the stove that drew his eyes, as it always had. It showed a grand estate, a mansion of white columns and tall windows and manicured gardens, a place of obvious wealth that seemed to belong to another world entirely. His grandmother had never explained the photograph, deflecting his questions with vague words about the past being past, and some doors being better left closed. He lifted the frame now and studied the image, the grand house staring back at him like a riddle without an answer. And he wondered what connection his grandmother could possibly have had to such a place when she had lived and died in such grinding poverty. The first night alone in the cabin was the longest of Samuel's young life, the darkness pressing in through the windows like something alive and hungry, the silence so complete that he could hear his own heartbeat and the scurrying of mice in the walls, and the creak of the old logs settling in the cold. He could not sleep, could not even bring himself to climb the ladder to his loft, because the emptiness of the cabin without his grandmother's breathing was more than he could bear. So instead he lit a candle, the flame guttering in the draughts that snaked through the old walls, and he began to do what he knew she would have wanted him to do, what mountain people always did when someone passed, which was to sort through her belongings and set things in order. He started with the small things, her sewing kit with its needles and thread and scraps of fabric saved for patches, her collection of dried herbs hanging from the rafters that filled the cabin with the smell of sage and mint, her few pieces of clothing worn so thin in places you could see light through them. Each item he touched carried her presence, the shape of her hands, the smell of her skin, and he handled them with a reverence that bordered on ritual, folding and stacking and placing them in neat piles, as if the orderliness could somehow keep his grief contained. He worked his way around the room methodically, finding nothing of value in the way the world measured value, but everything of worth in the way of memory and love. It was when he moved to clean behind the wood stove that he found it, kneeling on the worn floorboards, with a rag in his hand. His hand brushed against the wooden panel that formed the back of the stove alcove, and something about it felt wrong, felt different from the solid logs that made up the rest of the walls. He pressed against it, and felt it give slightly, not the firm resistance of a fixed structure, but the subtle movement of something designed to move. His heart began to beat faster as he examined the panel in the flickering candlelight, running his fingers along its edges until he found a small notch that allowed him to grip and pull. The panel swung outward on hidden hinges, revealing a dark compartment carved into the wall, a space perhaps 2 feet wide and 1 foot deep that had been completely unknown to him in all his years of living in this cabin. Inside the compartment, covered in dust that spoke of years of concealment, sat a leather satchel, old and cracked but still sturdy, its brass buckles tarnished to a dull green. Samuel's hands trembled as he reached for it, some instinct telling him that what he was about to find would change everything. He carried the satchel to the table and opened it in the candlelight, and what he found inside made the breath stop in his chest. There were legal documents, thick papers covered in formal language and official seals. There were letters, dozens of them, written in various hands, some dated decades ago. And there was a bank statement from a bank in Richmond, showing an account held in trust under his grandmother's name, containing a sum of money so large that Samuel had to count the digits 3 times to believe what he was seeing. It was more money than everyone in the mountain community possessed combined, and it had been sitting in some distant bank while his grandmother lived and died in poverty, while they scraped and struggled and went hungry in the winters when the food ran low. He sat staring at the papers spread before him, his young mind reeling as he tried to understand how this could be and why his grandmother had hidden it away and never spoken a word of it. Samuel sat at the rough wooden table until the candle burned down to a stub, and he had to light another, his eyes moving over the documents again and again, as if repetition might change what they said. But each reading only confirmed the impossible truth before him. The first document he fully comprehended was a last will and testament dated 1962, its language formal and dense with legal terms he had to puzzle through word by word, but its meaning was unmistakable. It declared that upon the death of one Cornelius Whitmore of Richmond, Virginia, his entire estate was to pass to his only surviving child, his daughter, Eliza Whitmore, to be hers, absolutely and without condition. Samuel read his grandmother's name 3 times, written in elegant script on this official document, connected to words like estate and holdings that had never had any place in their world of poverty. He turned to the next papers and found property deeds describing land and buildings in Richmond and beyond, townhouses and farmland, and commercial properties, each one listing Eliza Whitmore as the rightful owner. There were stock certificates too, ownership shares in companies whose names he recognized from the old newspapers pasted to the cabin walls, companies that made automobiles and steel, and all of them bore his grandmother's name, as if she had been some great lady of industry, rather than a woman who darned the same 3 dresses for 20 years. The will identified Eliza as the sole heir to the Whitmore family fortune, and Samuel grasped that Whitmore was a name of significance, a name that carried weight and the kind of power that came from generations of accumulated wealth. His grandmother had been born into one of the wealthiest dynasties in Virginia, a family whose influence had shaped the state for over a century, and yet she had lived out her days in a crumbling cabin, wearing patched clothes and eating beans, and never once speaking of her birthright. He turned to the letters next, and it was there that the story began to take a darker shape. The earliest letters were formal, written on expensive stationery from law firms, demanding that Eliza relinquish her claim to the estate, citing various technical grounds Samuel could not fully follow. Later letters dropped the legal pretense and became threatening, warning her that she was putting herself in danger, that accidents happened to people who did not know when to let go. One name appeared more frequently than any other, signed with a bold and arrogant hand: Frederick Whitmore. The letters made clear that Frederick considered himself the rightful master of the family fortune, and viewed Eliza's claim as an obstacle to be removed by whatever means necessary. The final letter was different, written on plain paper, in a hand that shook with age or emotion, addressed to Eliza directly. It warned her that Frederick had gone to the courts and had her declared mentally incompetent, that he had produced forged documents, bribed officials, and threatened witnesses, and that she was no longer safe anywhere his reach extended. The letter urged her to take her proof and hide herself away, to wait for a time when justice might be possible. And it was signed simply, "A friend who remembers the truth." Samuel set the letter down and stared at the cabin walls. His grandmother had not been poor by fate or failure, but by choice, a choice made to survive, to stay hidden from people who wanted her silenced, and who had stolen everything rightfully hers. The fortune was real, the inheritance was real, but so was the danger that had kept her from claiming it, and now that danger was his to face. Samuel had just finished hiding the satchel back in the compartment behind the wood stove, his hands still trembling from what he had read, when he heard a sound that did not belong to the mountain, a low mechanical hum that grew louder and resolved into the unmistakable purr of an expensive engine. He moved to the window and looked out through the grimy glass, and what he saw made his stomach clench with instinctive fear. A car was pulling into the rutted dirt path, but it was not like any car that ever came up this mountain, not the battered trucks of the neighbors or rusty sedans. This was a sleek black vehicle that gleamed even under the overcast sky, its lines smooth and modern, and speaking of money in a language that was universal, and it looked so out of place against the sagging cabin that it might have been a visitor from another planet. Samuel's mind immediately went to the documents he had just read, to the name Whitmore, and the letters full of threats, and every instinct told him to run into the woods where he knew paths no outsider could follow. But he did not run, because running would tell them he had something to hide. So he stood frozen and watched as the car stopped, and a man stepped out. The man was in his 50s, tall and well-built in the way of someone who had access to good food and gymnasiums, his silver hair swept back from a face that was handsome in a hard and polished way, like a statue carved to impress rather than inspire warmth. He wore a dark overcoat that looked like it cost more than everything in the cabin combined, and his polished leather shoes would be ruined by the mud, though he did not seem to care as he walked towards the porch, with the confident stride of a man accustomed to owning whatever ground he walked upon. Samuel opened the door before the man could knock, wanting to control at least that small thing, and he stood in the doorway, looking up at the stranger with sharp blue eyes, betraying nothing of the fear coiled in his chest. The man smiled, a practiced expression that showed his teeth, but did not reach his eyes, and when he spoke, his voice was smooth with the accent of old Virginia money. He introduced himself as Gerald Whitmore, Eliza's nephew, her brother Frederick's son, and said he had come to offer condolences and see if there was anything he could do for the boy she had left behind. The name Whitmore hit Samuel like a physical blow, confirming his fears and connecting this sleek stranger to the documents and 60 years of injustice. Gerald expressed sorrow at not having been closer to his aunt, speaking of family quarrels and wanting to make amends and see that Samuel was properly cared for. But even as he spoke these kind words, his eyes were moving, scanning the cabin with calculating interest, lingering on shelves and corners and the space behind the wood stove as if searching for something specific. Samuel understood with clarity beyond his years that this man had not come to help, but to find something, to retrieve whatever proof Eliza had kept hidden, and his concern was nothing but a mask over darker intentions. Gerald asked almost casually if Eliza had left any old papers, any documents or letters he might take as keepsakes. Samuel felt the danger concealed within the question, like a blade hidden in silk, and he knew the truth would put him in the same peril that had forced his grandmother into hiding. He looked up at Gerald with steady eyes and lied without hesitation, saying his grandmother had kept nothing of value, that she had been a poor woman with poor possessions, no papers beyond receipts and handwritten recipes. Gerald studied him, something flickering in those cold eyes, but Samuel held his gaze and did not waver, and finally the man nodded and smiled his empty smile. He pressed a business card into Samuel's hand, telling him to call if he found anything, then walked back to his gleaming car and drove away, leaving Samuel with the certain knowledge that this was only the beginning. Samuel stood in the doorway, long after the black car had disappeared down the mountain road, the business card clutched in his hand, feeling like something unclean that might leave a stain if he held it too long. Gerald Whitmore's parting words echoed in his mind, and the boy had heard the threat beneath the courtesy, as clearly as if the man had spoken it plain. He went back inside and closed the door, leaning against it for a moment, then moved to the wood stove and retrieved the leather satchel, with hands that were no longer trembling, but steady with new resolve. He spread the documents out in the grey afternoon light, and this time read with cold and careful attention, piecing together the story his grandmother had guarded in silence for 6 decades. The letters told the tale in fragments. Like a shattered mirror, he had to reassemble, but the picture that emerged was clear enough and dark enough to explain everything about the life Eliza had lived. His grandmother had been born Eliza Whitmore in 1932, the only daughter of Cornelius Whitmore, one of the wealthiest men in Virginia, whose family had built their fortune over generations in tobacco and timber, and later in banking and real estate. She had grown up in the grand estate from the photograph, surrounded by luxury and privilege, but also in the shadow of her older brother Frederick, a man who believed wealth and power were his birthright as the male heir, and who resented every indication that their father might divide the estate. The letters painted Frederick as a man of charm and cruelty in equal measure, who smiled in the parlour and schemed in the study, cultivating their father's favour while quietly undermining his sister. When Cornelius died in 1962, his will was unambiguous in leaving everything to Eliza, but Frederick launched a legal assault within months, producing documents claiming Eliza was mentally incompetent, documents bearing signatures she swore were forged, but that courts influenced by Whitmore, money accepted as genuine. Samuel read letters from lawyers threatened into silence, doctors paid for false testimony, servants and friends who witnessed the fraud but were too afraid to speak. The picture was of a conspiracy so thorough that Eliza never stood a chance, a single woman alone against her brother's wealth and utter lack of conscience. Frederick had her declared a ward of the state, stripped her of all legal rights, and installed himself as master of the fortune, and when Eliza tried to fight back, she received threats making clear her life was in danger. One letter described an attempt on her life, made to look like an accident, a fall downstairs that left her with a broken arm and certain knowledge that her brother would not stop until she was silenced permanently. It was then she made her choice. She gathered what proof she could, and fled in the night to the remote mountains where a childhood friend had once lived, and where the outside world seemed distant as the moon. She had built her life of deliberate poverty, not because she had no other option, but because invisibility was her only protection, because a poor woman in a forgotten cabin attracted no attention, and because every day she remained hidden was a day she remained alive. Samuel set down the last letter and sat in silence, the weight of his grandmother's sacrifice pressing down on him. She had given up everything, and she had done it not in defeat, but in defiance, keeping the proof safe for 60 years, in hope that someday justice might be possible. The money sat untouched because claiming it would have revealed her location and signed her death warrant. And now she was gone, and Gerald Whitmore had come with smooth words and searching eyes, and Samuel understood that the fight his grandmother had fled from had finally found its way to his door. The next morning, Samuel woke before dawn, having slept only in fitful stretches broken by dreams of black cars and men with cold eyes, and he knew that he could not carry the weight of what he had discovered alone. He needed someone to confirm what he had read, someone who had known his grandmother, not just as a poor mountain woman, but as whoever she had been before, and there was only one person in the world who might be able to do that. Martha Jennings lived in a small cabin about 2 miles down the ridge, a widow in her late 70s who had been his grandmother's closest friend for as long as Samuel could remember, the only person Eliza had ever truly confided in, and the only neighbor who came to visit regularly, rather than just nodding from a distance. Samuel had known Martha all his life, had sat in her kitchen eating gingerbread, while she and his grandmother talked in low voices about things he was too young to understand, and he had seen the way the two women looked at each other sometimes, a look of shared knowledge and shared secrets that went deeper than ordinary friendship. He set out on foot as the first light was turning the sky from black to grey, following the familiar path through the woods, with his jacket pulled tight against the cold, and the most important of the documents tucked inside his shirt, against his skin. The walk took him nearly an hour, the terrain steep and rocky in places, but he knew every root and stone, and did not slow his pace until he emerged from the tree line and saw Martha's cabin below him, smoke already rising from the chimney and a light glowing in the kitchen window. She must have seen him coming down the slope, because she had the door open before he reached the porch, her thin frame wrapped in a heavy shawl, and her face creased with concern as she looked at him with eyes that were still sharp despite her years. She asked no questions, just ushered him inside and sat him down at her kitchen table and put a cup of hot coffee in front of him. And then she sat across from him and waited with the patience of someone who understood that some things could not be rushed. Samuel pulled the documents from inside his shirt and laid them on the table between them. The will and the bank statement, and the most damning of the letters, and he watched Martha's face as she looked at them, and saw recognition and sorrow, and something like relief pass across her weathered features. She was quiet for a long moment, her gnarled fingers resting on the papers as if touching a holy relic, and when she finally spoke, her voice was soft and heavy with the weight of decades of silence. She told Samuel that she had known Eliza since 1963, when a frightened young woman had appeared in the mountains with nothing but a suitcase and a look of hunted desperation, and that over the years Eliza had told her everything, had needed to tell someone the truth or go mad from carrying it alone. Martha confirmed every detail that Samuel had pieced together from the documents, the inheritance, and the fraud, and the threats, and the flight into hiding. And she added details that the letters had not contained, stories of the fear Eliza had lived with every day, the way she would startle at unexpected sounds and scan the road whenever a strange vehicle passed through the valley. She explained that Eliza had lived in deliberate poverty, not just to stay hidden, but to stay forgotten. Because the Whitmores were people of wealth and influence who moved in circles of luxury and power, and they would never think to look for a rival claimant in a crumbling cabin where a woman grew her own food and patched her own clothes and lived without electricity or running water. The poverty was a disguise as much as a necessity, a way of becoming invisible to people who only saw value in wealth, and Eliza had maintained it with an iron discipline, even when Martha had offered to help her live more comfortably. Martha's voice grew more urgent as she spoke of the danger, her old hands gripping Samuel's across the table as she tried to make him understand what he was facing. She said that Eliza had believed until her dying day that the Whitmores would kill her if they ever found her, that they had already tried once and would not hesitate to try again, and that the evidence she possessed was the only thing that had kept her alive because they needed to find it and destroy it before they could be certain their secrets were safe. She told Samuel that Gerald Whitmore's visit was not a coincidence, that he must have learned of Eliza's death somehow and come immediately to search for the documents that could destroy his family's claim to the fortune, and that he would not stop until he had them or until Samuel was no longer a threat. Martha urged him to be extremely careful, to trust no one outside the mountain community, and to understand that he was now caught up in a fight that had already consumed 60 years of his grandmother's life, and might well consume his own if he was not smart and cautious. She held his hands and looked into his eyes with an intensity that frightened him more than anything else had, and she said that Eliza had kept those documents hidden all those years, not just to protect herself, but because she believed that someday someone would be able to use them, to set things right, to expose the fraud and reclaim what had been stolen, and bring the Whitmores to justice. She said that Eliza had died still believing that day would come, and that she had left the evidence to Samuel because she trusted him to be brave enough and smart enough to finish what she had never been able to finish herself. Samuel walked home through the woods with Martha's words ringing in his ears and the documents pressed against his chest, and he understood now that he had inherited not just a cabin and a claim to a fortune, but a duty to a grandmother who had sacrificed everything for the truth and had placed her final hope in a 12-year-old boy with sharp blue eyes and calloused hands and a heart that would not let her down. Samuel approached the cabin with the afternoon sun slanting through the bare trees and casting long shadows across the yard, and he knew before he even reached the porch that something was wrong. It was not a dramatic wrongness, not a door kicked in or windows shattered, but something subtler and in some ways more unsettling, a sense that the space he had left a few hours ago was not quite the same space he was returning to. He stopped at the edge of the clearing and studied the cabin with the same careful attention his grandmother had taught him to use when tracking deer, looking for signs that did not belong, and he found them one by one, like a trail of breadcrumbs leading to a conclusion he did not want to reach. The window on the east side of the cabin, the one with the cracked pane that he always kept latched because the wind would blow it open otherwise, was not latched now, but sat slightly ajar, a gap of perhaps half an inch that he knew had not been there when he left. The firewood he had stacked on the porch was still stacked, but the top pieces were arranged differently than he remembered, as if someone had moved them to look beneath, and then replaced them without knowing the exact order they had been in. The mat in front of the door, a ragged thing his grandmother had braided from old rags, was shifted a few inches to the left of where it usually sat, pushed aside by a foot, and not returned to its proper position. Each sign was small enough to be dismissed as imagination or faulty memory, but taken together they formed a picture that made Samuel's stomach clench and his heart beat faster with a fear that was becoming all too familiar. He did not go inside immediately, but circled the cabin first, staying in the tree line where he could not be easily seen, looking for any indication of who had been there or whether they might still be nearby. He found footprints in the soft earth beneath the east window, prints made by shoes with smooth soles, not the worn boots that everyone on the mountain wore. And he found a cigarette butt ground into the dirt near the back corner, a brand with a gold band around the filter that no one in the valley smoked. The searchers had not been locals, had not been anyone who belonged here, and Samuel felt a chill run through him that had nothing to do with the October air. He entered the cabin through the front door with his senses on high alert, half expecting to find someone waiting inside. But the single room was empty and silent, and filled with the grey light of the fading afternoon. The signs of disturbance inside were even more apparent to his knowing eyes than the signs outside had been. The few books on the shelf were in a slightly different order than his grandmother had always kept them. The lid of the trunk at the foot of the bed was not quite flush with the frame. The newspapers on the walls had been touched and pressed in places, as if someone had been feeling for hidden compartments behind them. And the wood stove had been pulled out from the wall by a few inches, not enough to reveal the hidden panel, but enough to show that someone had been looking in that area, had suspected that the alcove might contain more than it appeared to. Samuel went immediately to the compartment and found it still sealed, the panel in place, and the satchel undisturbed behind it, and he allowed himself a moment of relief that was quickly swallowed by a deeper anxiety. The searchers had not found the documents this time, but they had come close, and they would certainly come back now that they knew or suspected that there was something here worth finding. Gerald Whitmore was not going to give up after one failed attempt, not when 60 years of fraud and a fortune beyond imagining hung in the balance, and the next search would be more thorough and more aggressive, and might not come when Samuel was conveniently away. The documents were no longer safe in the cabin, that much was clear, and Samuel realized with a growing sense of urgency that he needed to find a better hiding place, and he needed to find help that extended beyond the mountain and its small community of poor farmers and widows. Martha Jennings could offer wisdom and confirmation and a place to run if things got desperate, but she could not stand against the Whitmores and their money and their lawyers and their willingness to do whatever was necessary to protect their stolen fortune. Samuel needed someone with power of their own, someone who could take the evidence he possessed and use it in ways that he could not. And he thought about the documents he had read, and the names that had appeared in them, and the law firms in Richmond that had once tried to help his grandmother before being threatened into silence. He did not know if any of those people were still alive, or still practicing, or still brave enough to take on the Whitmore family, but he knew that he had to try, because the alternative was to wait in this cabin like a rabbit in a trap, while the wolves circled closer and closer. He took the satchel from its compartment and held it in his hands, feeling the weight of the papers inside, the weight of his grandmother's sacrifice, and her hope, and her trust in him, and he made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff into darkness. He would find a new hiding place for the documents, somewhere not even Martha knew about, and then he would find a way to reach out beyond the mountain and find an ally who could help him bring the Whitmores to justice. He was 12 years old, and alone, and facing an enemy with resources he could barely comprehend, but he was also Eliza Whitmore's grandson, and she had not raised him to be afraid. Samuel stood in the center of the cabin with the leather satchel in his hands, his mind racing through every possible hiding place he could think of, and rejecting each one as too obvious or too accessible to someone conducting a thorough search. The compartment behind the wood stove had been clever enough to fool him for 12 years, but the searchers had already come close to finding it, and next time they would not stop at pulling the stove out a few inches, but would tear the wall apart board by board if necessary. He needed somewhere deeper, somewhere more secret, somewhere that even a determined search would not uncover. And as he stood there in the fading light with desperation beginning to claw at his chest, he remembered something his grandmother had told him years ago, a story he had half forgotten because it had seemed like just another of her mountain tales meant to entertain a young boy on a winter evening. She had spoken of a root cellar beneath the cabin, a small chamber dug into the earth and lined with stones by the people who had built this place long before she came to it, a cellar that had been sealed up and hidden so well that even the rats did not know about it. He had asked her where it was, with the eager curiosity of a child who loved secrets and hidden places, but she had only smiled and said that some secrets kept themselves better when they were not spoken aloud, and that if he ever truly needed to find it, he would remember how. He had puzzled over her words at the time, and then forgotten them, as children forget things that do not seem immediately important. But now they came back to him with a clarity that felt like a gift from beyond the grave, his grandmother reaching out one last time to help him when he needed her most. She had told him other things too, fragments that he had to piece together like a puzzle, mentions of the bed where she slept, and the boards that creaked in a certain way, and the place where the cold came up from the earth, even in summer. Samuel went to her bed, the narrow iron frame with its thin mattress that still held the impression of her body, and he pushed it aside with an effort that strained his wiry muscles, dragging it across the floor until the space beneath where it had stood was fully revealed. The floorboards there looked the same as all the others, wide planks of pine darkened by age and wear, but he got down on his hands and knees and examined them closely, pressing on each one to feel for any give or movement that might indicate a board that was not nailed down as firmly as the rest. He found it near the wall, a board that shifted slightly under his weight, and that had a tiny notch cut into one end, almost invisible unless you were looking for it, just large enough to hook a finger into and pull. His heart was pounding as he worked his finger into the notch and lifted, and the board came up with a soft groan of old wood, revealing a dark gap beneath, and a smell of cold earth and stone that rose up to meet him like breath from the depths of the mountain itself. He pulled up the adjacent board and the one next to that, widening the opening until he could see what lay below. And there it was, just as his grandmother had described, a small chamber perhaps 4 feet square and 3 feet deep, its walls lined with carefully fitted stones that had been placed there by hands that were dust long before Samuel was born. A crude ladder of wooden rungs was fixed to one wall, leading down into the darkness, and the floor of the chamber was hard packed earth that looked as though it had not been disturbed in decades. Samuel retrieved the candle from the table and lit it, then lowered himself carefully through the opening and down the ladder into the root cellar, the cool air wrapping around him like a blanket, and the silence so complete that he could hear his own heartbeat echoing off the stone walls. The chamber was empty, except for a few old clay pots that had perhaps once held preserves, and a wooden shelf built into one wall that had long since rotted and collapsed, but it was dry and secure and utterly hidden from anyone who did not know exactly where to look. This was the place, the final sanctuaries that his grandmother had kept secret even from him until the moment he needed it, and he felt a wave of gratitude and sorrow wash over him as he realized how carefully she had prepared for a day she hoped would never come. He climbed back up the ladder and retrieved the satchel, then descended again and placed it in the far corner of the chamber, where it would be invisible to anyone who somehow managed to find the opening and peer down into the darkness. He stood there for a moment, with his hand resting on the old leather, making a silent promise to his grandmother that he would protect what she had guarded for so long, and that he would find a way to use it to set things right. Then he climbed out of the cellar and replaced the floorboards carefully, pressing them down until they sat flush and seamless with the rest of the floor, and pushed the bed back into its position over the hidden entrance. The documents were safe now, safer than they had ever been. But Samuel was not foolish enough to put all of his hope in one hiding place. He had kept one document out of the satchel, the most important one, the original will that named his grandmother as the sole heir to the Whitmore fortune, and he folded it carefully and placed it inside his shirt against his skin, where it would go wherever he went. If something happened to him, if the Whitmores caught him and forced him to reveal the cellar's location, at least the most crucial piece of evidence would not be there for them to find. He would carry it with him like a talisman, a piece of his grandmother's truth that would stay close to his heart until he could find someone trustworthy enough to help him use it. The walk down to the valley took Samuel nearly 2 hours, the path winding steeply through hollows, thick with fallen leaves, and across streams that he had to hop on stones worn smooth by generations of mountain feet. He had set out at first light with the will folded inside his shirt and a few coins in his pocket, coins his grandmother had kept in a tin for emergencies, and that he had never imagined using for something like this. The general store in the valley was the only place within 10 miles that had a telephone available for public use, a payphone mounted on the wall near the back that the owner allowed people to use for a small fee. And Samuel had never made a call on it in his life, but had watched others do it enough times to understand the basic procedure. The store was quiet when he arrived, just the owner behind the counter reading a newspaper, and an old man in overalls examining a display of hand tools, and Samuel nodded to them both and made his way to the phone, with his heart beating so hard he could feel it in his throat. He had memorized the number from the letterhead on the old documents, Ashford and Associates of Richmond, the law firm that had once tried to help his grandmother before being threatened into silence, and he did not know if they still existed or if anyone there would remember the name Eliza Whitmore or care about a case that was 60 years old. He deposited the coins and dialed the number with fingers that trembled slightly, and he listened to the phone ring once, twice, 3 times, each ring stretching out like an eternity while he tried to figure out what he would say if someone answered, and what he would do if no one did. On the 4th ring, there was a click, and a woman's voice came on the line, young and professional, and slightly hurried, saying the name of the firm and asking how she could help. Samuel's mouth went dry, and for a moment he could not speak, could not find the words to explain who he was, and why he was calling, and what he needed. And the woman asked again if anyone was there, a note of impatience creeping into her voice. He forced himself to speak, his voice coming out higher and younger than he wanted it to, and he said that his name was Samuel, and that his grandmother had just died, and that her name was Eliza Whitmore, and that he had found documents with this firm's name on them from a long time ago. The silence on the other end of the line was so complete that Samuel thought the connection had been lost, and he was about to speak again, when the woman's voice came back, completely transformed from its earlier brisk professionalism into something hushed and stunned and almost breathless. She said her name was Claire Ashford, and that she was the granddaughter of the man who had founded the firm, and she asked Samuel to repeat what he had just said, because she needed to be sure she had heard him correctly. He told her again, told her about Eliza, and the documents, and the hidden compartment, and Gerald Whitmore's visit. And with each word he spoke, the silence on the other end grew heavier and more charged until it felt like the air before a thunderstorm. Claire Ashford told him that her grandfather had spoken of Eliza Whitmore until the day he died, had called her the greatest failure of his career, and the injustice that haunted him most, and that he had kept a file on her case in his personal records even after he was forced to abandon it, hoping that someday someone would come forward with the evidence needed to reopen it. She said that she had read that file when she joined the firm, had been moved and outraged by the story it contained, and had wondered many times what had happened to the woman who had vanished into the mountains with nothing but the truth. Her voice was shaking now, and Samuel realized that this call meant as much to her as it did to him, that the Whitmore case was not just ancient history to be filed away, but a wound that had never healed, a debt that her family felt they still owed. She told Samuel that she needed to meet him, needed to see the documents he had found, and that she would drive up to the mountains herself as soon as she could arrange it, because this was not something to be discussed over the phone, and not something she was willing to trust to anyone else. Samuel gave her directions to Martha Jennings's cabin, not wanting to lead anyone directly to his own home, and they agreed to meet in 3 days' time. And when he hung up the phone, his hand was shaking, and his eyes were burning with tears. He refused to let fall. He walked out of the store into the bright morning sunlight, and stood there for a moment, breathing deeply, feeling for the first time since his grandmother's death that he was not entirely alone in this fight. The 3 days of waiting for Claire Ashford stretched out like weeks, each hour heavy with tension and the growing certainty that Gerald Whitmore would not sit idle. The intimidation began on the first night after his call to Richmond. He woke before dawn to find his firewood pile scattered across the yard as if a violent wind had struck it, though the air was perfectly still. The logs he had spent days splitting and stacking were strewn in every direction, and the message was clear. We can reach you whenever we want, and there is nothing you can do to stop us. Samuel spent the morning restacking the wood with his jaw set and his eyes hard, refusing to let them see him shaken. The second incident came the following evening, more disturbing for its deliberate cruelty. Samuel returned from checking his snares to find a crow on his porch, its wings spread wide, and its head twisted at an unnatural angle, placed with deliberate care like a threat on his threshold. He knew what a dead crow meant in the old traditions, a sign of death and dark things to come. He picked up the bird with bare hands and buried it beneath an oak tree with quiet words of apology. That night he sat by the window, and just as the last light faded, he saw what he had been dreading. A figure standing at the edge of the forest, motionless and watching. It was too dark to make out features, just a silhouette among the shadows, but Samuel could feel the weight of that gaze like physical pressure. He did not look away or show any sign of disturbance, meeting the distant watcher's stare in a silent contest of wills. The figure remained for 10 minutes, then melted back into the forest. Samuel sat until full night had fallen, feeling the fear Gerald Whitmore wanted him to feel, but also something harder, a cold anger that burned like an ember. This was his grandmother's home, where she had endured 60 years of fear and never surrendered, and her strength lived on in him. He would not run or hide or be silenced. Let them watch from the trees. They would learn soon enough that this mountain boy was not so easily frightened. Claire Ashford arrived at Martha Jennings's cabin on the 3rd day exactly when she had promised, a small silver car dusty from the rough roads and dented in places that suggested its owner was not overly concerned with appearances. The woman who stepped out was younger than Samuel had expected, perhaps in her early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical knot and sharp, intelligent eyes behind simple, wire-framed glasses. She was dressed in sturdy boots and dark jeans, and a heavy jacket more suited to hiking than courtrooms, and she introduced herself with a firm handshake and a direct gaze that met his eyes without condescension. Martha served coffee, and Samuel told his story from the beginning, while Claire listened without interruption, her expression growing more serious with each detail. When he pulled the will from inside his shirt and unfolded it on the table, she read it with intense care, her fingers resting on the document as if she could feel the weight of its history. She told them her grandfather had suspected fraud in the Whitmore case from the beginning, convinced that documents were forged and witnesses bribed, but every avenue he pursued was blocked. The case had haunted him his entire life, and he had kept the file because he could not bear to let it be forgotten. She had read that file when she joined the firm 5 years ago, and had wondered many times what became of Eliza Whitmore. Now, here was the proof her grandfather had searched for. She confirmed the will appeared genuine, and that they had enough evidence to reopen the case and bring criminal charges. But then her expression grew somber. The legal path would not be easy or safe. The Whitmores had spent 60 years building connections in business, politics, and law enforcement. The local sheriff had received significant campaign contributions from Whitmore interests and could not be trusted. She asked Samuel if he understood what he was getting into, and he met her gaze without flinching, and said his grandmother had fought this fight alone for 60 years, and he would not dishonor her memory by giving up. Claire smiled and said her grandfather would have liked him very much. Samuel returned to his cabin that evening with Claire's, warnings echoing in his mind, and a plan already forming for what he would do if the Whitmores escalated from intimidation to direct action. He did not have to wait long to find out. The night came on cold and moonless, the darkness so complete that he could barely see his hand in front of his face, and he sat by the window as he had done the previous nights, watching the tree line for any sign of movement. He had moved his grandmother's bed away from the wall and repositioned it near the back window, the one that opened onto the steep slope behind the cabin, where the forest grew thick and tangled within 20 feet of the walls, and he had practiced the route in his mind until he could see it with his eyes closed, the window to the ground, to the trees, to the deer path that wound up the ridge, to a rocky outcropping where he had played as a child, and where no one who did not know the mountain could hope to follow. The will was inside his shirt, as always, pressed against his skin like a second heartbeat, and he had laid out his warmest jacket and his sturdiest boots beside the bed, so he could grab them in seconds if the moment came. It came just after midnight, announced by a sound that did not belong to the night, the soft crunch of footsteps on the fallen leaves at the front of the cabin, more than one set moving with a deliberate stealth that was somehow more frightening than if they had come loudly and openly. Samuel was on his feet instantly, his body moving before his mind had fully registered what was happening, and he pulled on his boots and jacket with hands that were steady, despite the terror coursing through him. He heard voices outside, low and muffled, and then a heavy impact against the front door that shook the whole cabin and told him they were not bothering with subtlety this time. He did not wait for them to break through, but went straight to the back window, lifting it as quietly as he could, and slipping through the opening into the cold night air, dropping to the ground, and pressing himself flat against the cabin wall as another impact sounded from the front, and the door gave way with a splintering crash. He could see light now, flashlight beams sweeping through the windows, and he heard the men enter, 2 of them from the sound of their footsteps, and he heard them begin to tear the cabin apart with a methodical violence that made clear they would not stop until they found what they were looking for. Samuel ran, keeping low and using the darkness as cover, his feet finding the deer path by memory and instinct, and he did not stop until he reached the outcropping, high on the ridge, where he could look down at the cabin without being seen. He crouched there among the cold stones, with his breath coming in ragged gasps, and his body shaking from fear and exertion, and he watched the flashlight beams move through his home like searching eyes, watched shadows pass before the windows as the men overturned furniture and tore open cabinets and ripped the newspapers from the walls. He could not hear what they were saying, but he could imagine their frustration as they failed to find what Gerald Whitmore had sent them for, could imagine them pulling up floorboards and knocking on walls, and never thinking to move the bed and look beneath it, because the hiding place his grandmother had chosen was too old and too clever and too patient for men like these. They searched for what felt like hours, while Samuel huddled on the ridge with the cold seeping into his bones and the will pressed against his chest. And when they finally gave up and left, their flashlights disappearing down the mountain road, he remained where he was, too frightened to move and too stubborn to surrender to the fear. He spent the rest of the night in the forest, curled against a rock with his jacket pulled tight around him, shivering and terrified, but holding on to the knowledge that they had not found the root cellar, and they had not found the will, and they had not broken him. When dawn finally came, grey and cold and beautiful, he rose on stiff legs and made his way back down the ridge toward whatever was left of his home. Samuel descended the ridge as the first grey light of dawn filtered through the trees, his body stiff and aching from the cold night spent huddled among the rocks, his mind bracing for what he would find when he reached the cabin. The structure still stood, that much he could see from a distance, the log walls and tin roof intact against the pale sky. But as he drew closer and stepped through the shattered front door, his heart sank at the devastation that greeted him. The cabin had been torn apart with a thoroughness that spoke of rage as much as purpose. Every drawer emptied onto the floor, every shelf swept clean, the mattress slashed open, and its stuffing scattered like snow across the wreckage. His grandmother's few possessions lay broken and strewn about, her ceramic dishes shattered, her books torn and trampled, her rocking chair overturned with one arm snapped off, and Samuel felt a grief that was almost as sharp as what he had felt at her funeral, a violation of her memory and her sanctuary that went beyond the mere destruction of objects. But even as the grief washed through him, he felt a grim satisfaction beneath it, because the floorboards under where the bed had stood were undisturbed, the entrance to the root cellar still hidden and sealed, and the satchel with its precious documents remained safe in the darkness below. He was still standing in the wreckage when he heard a car approaching, and his body tensed until he recognized the dusty silver vehicle that came into view. Claire Ashford arriving for their planned meeting and finding something far worse than she had expected. She stopped the car and stepped out, and the look on her face when she saw the cabin told Samuel everything about how bad it truly was, her expression shifting from shock to horror to a cold, hard anger that matched what he felt in his own chest. She insisted immediately that they could not go to the local sheriff, not after what she had learned about his connections to the Whitmores, and that they needed to take everything to the state police, where Gerald's influence would not reach. Samuel nodded and led her inside, picking his way through the debris to the spot where the bed had been, and he pulled up the floorboards and descended into the root cellar, while Claire watched from above with wonder on her face. He emerged with the satchel, its contents untouched and safe, and Claire took out her phone and began photographing every document with meticulous care. The will, and the deeds, and the letters, and the bank statements, creating a digital record that she immediately uploaded to her firm's secure server, where no break-in or theft could ever destroy it. The evidence was preserved now, copied and protected, and as Samuel watched her work, he felt for the first time that they might actually have a chance. The drive to the state police headquarters took nearly 4 hours, the mountain roads giving way to highways, and then to the outskirts of the city, a world so different from Samuel's Hollow that he might have been traveling to another country. He sat in the passenger seat of Claire's car with the satchel on his lap, watching the landscape change from forested ridges to rolling farmland, to clusters of buildings that grew denser and taller until they were surrounded by the noise and motion of urban life. Claire talked to him as she drove, preparing him for what to expect, explaining that the state police would be thorough and skeptical, and that he would need to tell his story clearly and completely without leaving anything out. And Samuel listened and nodded and tried to calm the nervous energy that made his leg bounce against the floorboard. The headquarters was a large brick building with flags out front and police vehicles parked in rows, and Samuel felt very small and very young as he walked through the glass doors into a lobby that smelled of floor wax and coffee. Claire had called ahead, and they were expected, escorted by a uniformed officer, to a conference room where 2 detectives in plain clothes were waiting. A man and a woman with notepads and recorders and expressions that were polite, but guarded in a way that told Samuel they had heard plenty of stories, and believed very few of them. He told them everything, starting with his grandmother's death and the hidden compartment, and ending with the break-in 2 nights ago. And he watched their faces as he spoke, watched the skepticism flicker when he mentioned the Whitmore name, and saw them exchange a glance that suggested they knew exactly who that family was and how much trouble this case could bring. Claire spread the documents on the table, the photographs she had taken printed out in crisp detail, and she walked the detectives through each one with the precision of someone who, had spent her life in courtrooms explaining the legal significance of the will and the evidence of forgery and the pattern of threats that the letters revealed. The detectives studied the papers with growing interest, their guarded expressions giving way to something more engaged as the weight of evidence accumulated before them, and Samuel could see them beginning to believe, despite whatever political considerations were whispering caution in their ears. The female detective finally looked up and said that they would need to verify the documents and conduct their own investigation, but that based on what she was seeing, there was more than enough to open an official case. She told Samuel that he had been brave to come forward and that they would do everything in their power to protect him while the investigation proceeded. And as she spoke those words, Samuel felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he had been carrying since the night he found the satchel finally beginning to ease. The black car returned 3 days after Samuel's visit to the state police, appearing on the mountain road like a dark omen against the grey autumn sky, and this time Gerald Whitmore did not bother with smiles or pretenses of familial concern. Samuel was on the porch when the car pulled up, having seen it coming from a distance, and having decided that he would not hide or run, but would face whatever came with the same resolve his grandmother had shown for 60 years. Gerald stepped out of the vehicle and strode toward the cabin, with a fury barely contained in his rigid posture and clenched jaw, his expensive clothes seeming almost absurd against the backdrop of the ransacked cabin and the wild mountain forest. And when he reached the porch steps, he stopped and looked up at Samuel with eyes that held no more pretense of warmth or civility. He told Samuel that he knew about the state police, knew about the investigation that had been opened and the documents that had been submitted, and he spoke the words like accusations, like crimes that Samuel had committed against him rather than the other way around. His voice was different now, stripped of the smooth, cultured tones he had used on his first visit, raw and harsh, and vibrating with a desperation that told Samuel the investigation was already causing damage that Gerald had not anticipated. He made his offer bluntly, without preamble or negotiation, a sum of money that he named as if it should make Samuel's knees buckle with gratitude, enough to leave the mountain and start over somewhere far away, and never speak of Eliza Whitmore, or the documents, or the inheritance again. Samuel listened to the number, and felt nothing, no temptation and no wavering, because no amount of money could equal what his grandmother had sacrificed, and no payment could purchase his silence about the truth she had died protecting. He told Gerald no, the single word dropping between them like a stone into still water, and he saw the man's face change, the desperation curdling into something uglier and more dangerous. Gerald stepped closer, close enough that Samuel could smell his cologne and see the vein pulsing in his temple, and he spoke in a low voice that was almost a whisper, but carried more menace than any shout. He said that accidents happened to boys who lived alone in the mountains, that people disappeared in these hollows and were never found, that Samuel should think very carefully about whether a pile of old papers was worth his life. Samuel did not step back or look away, but held Gerald's gaze with his sharp blue eyes, and said that his grandmother had thought so, and that he did too. Gerald stared at him for a long moment, something flickering in his expression that might have been surprise or grudging respect, or simply the recalculation of a predator assessing more dangerous prey than expected, and then he turned without another word and walked back to his car and drove away. Samuel watched until the black vehicle disappeared around the bend, and then he went inside to call Claire and tell her what had happened. Samuel knew that Gerald's threat had not been an empty one, knew that a man who had participated in 60 years of fraud and cover-up would not hesitate to eliminate a 12-year-old boy who stood between him and the preservation of his stolen fortune. But he also knew that he could not leave the cabin and the land that his grandmother had sacrificed everything to protect. This was his home, the only home he had ever known, and it held not just the evidence that could bring the Whitmores to justice, but the memory of the woman who had raised him and loved him and taught him that some things were worth standing for, even when standing was dangerous. He had made his decision, and he would not waver from it. But he was not foolish enough to think he could face what was coming entirely alone. And so he was grateful beyond words when Martha Jennings appeared at his door the morning after Gerald's visit, and told him that he would not have to. Word had spread through the mountain community with the speed that only small, tight-knit places can achieve, passed from cabin to cabin and hollow to hollow. The story of what Samuel had found, and what the Whitmores had done, and what danger the boy now faced, and the response had been immediate and unanimous. These were people who had known Eliza Whitmore for decades, who had received her help in times of need without ever being asked for anything in return, who remembered how she had nursed the sick and fed the hungry, and never turned anyone away from her door, despite having almost nothing herself. She had delivered babies and sat with the dying, and given her last jar of preserves to families whose children were hungry, and she had done it all quietly and without expectation of thanks, and now those families saw a chance to repay a debt they had long wished to honor. Martha explained the plan as she sat at Samuel's table with a cup of coffee warming her gnarled hands, telling him that the families had organized a watch rotation, with someone always positioned in the woods near the cabin, armed and alert, and ready to raise an alarm if strangers approached. Tom Sutter, whose wife Eliza had nursed through a difficult birth 15 years ago, would take the night shifts with his hunting rifle and his keen eyes that could spot a deer at 200 yards in the dark. The Crawford brothers, who ran a small sawmill down the valley, and whose father Eliza had helped bury with dignity when they could not afford a proper funeral, would cover the early mornings and late evenings. Old Mrs. Patterson, who was 78 and frail, but could still shoot straight and refused to be left out, would watch during the midday hours from a blind her grandsons had built for her on the ridge overlooking the road. Others would fill in the gaps, a rotating guard of mountain people who knew this land better than any outsider ever could, and who would not allow one of their own to be harmed by rich men from the city who thought their money could buy anything and anyone. Samuel listened to Martha describe the protective ring that was forming around him, and felt tears prick at his eyes that he fought to hold back, not tears of fear or sadness, but of a gratitude so profound it seemed to fill his chest and make it hard to breathe. He had thought he was alone in this fight, a boy of 12 against a family with wealth and power and connections that reached into every corner of the state. But he was not alone, and never had been. His grandmother had spent her life quietly helping others, never seeking recognition or repayment, and now that lifetime of kindness was returning to shelter her grandson in his hour of greatest need. The community that gathered around him was not large or wealthy or powerful by any measure the outside world would recognize, but they were loyal and determined, and they knew these mountains like they knew their own hands, and Gerald Whitmore would find that his threats and his money meant nothing here. Samuel thanked Martha with a voice that trembled slightly despite his efforts to control it, and she patted his hand and told him that Eliza had been the best of them, and that protecting her boy was the least they could do. That night, Samuel slept better than he had since his grandmother's death, knowing that somewhere in the darkness outside, someone was watching over him. Claire called Samuel 4 days later, her voice carrying an excitement he could hear even through the static of Martha's old telephone, telling him she had found something in her grandfather's archived files that could break the case wide open. Buried among yellowed papers in storage, she had discovered a folder labeled with a single word that made her hands tremble. Witnesses. Inside were original statements from people who had worked in the Whitmore household 60 years ago, describing in damning detail how Frederick Whitmore had orchestrated the fraud against his sister. These statements had been suppressed before they could ever be entered into evidence, the witnesses paid off or frightened into silence, But Claire's grandfather had kept copies because he knew someday they might matter. Most witnesses were long dead, but one name made Claire's heart race. Dorothy Marsh, a secretary in the Whitmore family's law firm in 1962, now 93, and living in a nursing home outside Charlottesville. They drove 3 hours to the facility the next morning, and the nurse led them to a small private room, where a tiny woman with white hair sat by the window, her body frail, but her eyes surprisingly clear. When Claire mentioned she was Robert Ashford's granddaughter, something shifted in Dorothy's face, recognition and relief, as if she had been waiting 60 years for someone to say those words. She told them everything, her memory sharp despite the decades, describing how she had watched them forge Eliza's signature, had typed letters to corrupt officials, and had been paid to keep silent with money she never spent because it felt like blood. Her voice broke as she spoke of Eliza, the frightened young woman whose face had haunted her dreams for 6 decades. Claire recorded every word, and when Dorothy finished, she took Samuel's hand and told him his grandmother had deserved better, and that she was sorry she had not been brave enough to speak sooner. The investigation that Samuel had set in motion with his visit to the state police grew like a fire finding dry timber, spreading from the initial documents to encompass the entire sprawling edifice of Whitmore family corruption that had stood unchallenged for 6 decades. Claire called him every few days with updates, her voice carrying a mixture of excitement and disbelief as she described how the case was expanding beyond anything they had imagined, how the state police had brought in forensic accountants to examine the Whitmore financial records, and how those accountants were finding irregularities that went far beyond the original theft of Eliza's inheritance. The family had not simply stolen once, and then lived quietly on their ill-gotten wealth, but had continued their pattern of fraud and manipulation for generations, using their money and influence to evade taxes, bribe officials, destroy competitors, and silence anyone who threatened to expose them. The forensic accountants found shell companies and hidden accounts and falsified records going back decades, a web of financial crime so extensive and so brazen that it spoke of absolute confidence that they would never be held accountable. And each new discovery added charges to the growing case against Gerald Whitmore and opened investigations into associates and employees who had helped maintain the family's criminal enterprise. Dorothy Marsh's recorded testimony had been transcribed and entered into evidence, and her account of witnessing the original forgery had proven to be the key that unlocked doors that had been sealed for 60 years, giving investigators the context they needed to understand the documents Samuel had found and to trace the conspiracy from its origins to the present day. The news began to leak out, despite efforts to keep the investigation confidential. Whispers at first, and then louder rumors that spread through Richmond's legal and business communities, and Gerald Whitmore must have sensed that the walls were closing in, because 2 weeks after Samuel's visit to Dorothy Marsh, he made his move. He booked a private flight to a country without an extradition treaty, packed 2 suitcases with cash and essential documents, and drove to the airport in his black car, with the confidence of a man who had always been able to buy his way out of trouble. But the state police had been watching him, had anticipated that a man facing the destruction of everything he had built on lies and theft would try to run, and they were waiting for him at the terminal with handcuffs and a warrant. The arrest was captured by news cameras that had been tipped off, images of Gerald Whitmore in his expensive coat being led away by uniformed officers, broadcast across every television station in Virginia, and picked up by national networks hungry for a story of wealth and corruption and downfall. Samuel watched the coverage on Martha's small television, saw the man who had threatened his life reduced to a hunched figure trying to hide his face from the cameras, and he felt not triumph or satisfaction, but a strange hollow sadness that it had taken so long and cost so much for this moment to arrive. The charges were read in a press conference that afternoon. Fraud, conspiracy, witness tampering, obstruction of justice, and a dozen other counts that could put Gerald Whitmore in prison for the rest of his life. Reporters spoke of the Whitmore family's fall from grace, of a dynasty built on theft and maintained by intimidation finally being brought to account. And they spoke of the 12-year-old boy in the mountains who had found his grandmother's hidden documents and had the courage to bring them forward. Samuel turned off the television and walked outside into the cool mountain air, looking up at the ridges that had sheltered his grandmother for 60 years, and he wished more than anything that she could have lived to see this day. The letter from the Richmond law firm arrived at Martha's cabin 2 weeks after Gerald Whitmore's arrest, a thick envelope of expensive cream-colored paper that felt heavy with importance and desperation in equal measure. Claire drove up to the mountain to deliver it personally, and she sat with Samuel at Martha's kitchen table as he opened it and read the contents, his sharp blue eyes moving over the formal legal language with a focus that belied his 12 years. The Whitmore family's remaining attorneys, a prestigious firm that had represented their interests for generations and was now scrambling to distance itself from the scandal, were requesting a meeting to discuss a potential settlement of all claims related to the estate of Cornelius Whitmore. They wrote in careful phrases about avoiding prolonged litigation and achieving closure for all parties and other terms that Samuel recognized as the language of people who wanted something to go away quietly, and they proposed a meeting in Richmond at their offices to discuss terms that they believed would be satisfactory to everyone involved. Claire explained what the letter meant in plain terms, telling Samuel that the Whitmores knew they were going to lose and were trying to cut their losses, hoping to pay him off with a fraction of what his grandmother had been owed and get him to sign away any further claims before the full extent of their crimes became public. She advised him that he had the right to refuse the meeting entirely and let the courts decide, or to attend and hear what they had to say without any obligation to accept. And she told him that whatever he decided, she would be beside him to ensure that no one took advantage of a boy facing a room full of expensive lawyers. Samuel thought about it for a long time, sitting in silence while Martha and Claire waited, and then he said that he wanted to go, wanted to look these people in the eye and hear what they thought his grandmother's stolen life was worth to them. They drove to Richmond 3 days later, Claire and Samuel in her dusty silver car, and they parked in front of a gleaming office tower that rose into the sky like a monument to the kind of wealth and power that Samuel had never known and never wanted. The conference room they were led to was larger than his entire cabin, with a long, polished table and leather chairs and windows that looked out over the city. And sitting on the other side of the table were 4 attorneys in suits that probably cost more than everything Samuel owned. They were polite and professional, and spoke to him with a careful respect that felt rehearsed, and they laid out their offer with charts and documents that showed the value of the estate and the proposed settlement amount, a sum that they presented as generous and fair, and that Samuel recognized immediately as an insult. They were offering him less than 1/10 of what the estate was worth, a payment designed to make him go away and keep quiet while they retained the vast majority of the fortune that had been stolen from his grandmother 60 years ago. Claire asked questions and took notes and made sure that Samuel understood every detail of what was being proposed, and the attorneys answered with the smooth confidence of people who were accustomed to getting what they wanted through patience and pressure, and the sheer exhaustion of those who opposed them. When they finished their presentation, they looked at Samuel expectantly, waiting for the poor mountain boy to be overwhelmed by numbers he had never imagined, and to accept their offer with gratitude. Samuel looked at the documents spread across the polished table, at the charts showing the value of properties and investments that should have belonged to his grandmother. And he thought about the life she had lived in that crumbling cabin, patching the same clothes for 20 years, and going hungry in hard winters, and dying without ever seeing justice. He looked up at the attorneys with his sharp blue eyes, and told them that he would not accept any settlement that did not include full acknowledgement of the crime that had been committed against Eliza Whitmore, full restitution of everything that had been stolen, and a public admission of the fraud that had destroyed her life. The attorneys exchanged glances and began to explain why that was not possible, but Samuel stood up from the table and told them that he would see them in court. Claire followed him out of the conference room with a smile on her face that she did not try to hide. The civil trial began on a cold morning in January, 4 months after Gerald Whitmore's arrest, in a Richmond courthouse that seemed to Samuel like a temple built to intimidate ordinary people, with its marble columns and vaulted ceilings, and the weight of authority that pressed down from every surface. He sat at the plaintiff's table beside Claire, wearing the only suit he had ever owned, a simple dark one that Martha had helped him purchase for the occasion, and he looked across the aisle at the team of attorneys still representing the Whitmore estate, fewer now than at the settlement meeting, but still formidable in their numbers and their expensive confidence. The courtroom gallery was packed with reporters and spectators who had followed the case as it grew from a local story into a national sensation, the tale of a poor mountain boy fighting to reclaim his grandmother's stolen birthright from one of Virginia's oldest and most powerful families, and Samuel felt their eyes on him like a physical weight as the proceedings began. The trial lasted 2 weeks, a parade of witnesses and documents and expert testimony that laid out in devastating detail the fraud that Frederick Whitmore had perpetrated 60 years ago, and that his descendants had maintained and protected ever since. Forensic accountants explained the financial irregularities they had uncovered. Handwriting experts testified that the signatures on the documents used to declare Eliza incompetent were forgeries. Dorothy Marsh appeared by video from her nursing home, her thin voice filling the courtroom as she described what she had witnessed and apologized for her decades of silence. But it was Samuel's testimony that became the heart of the trial, the moment that everyone who was present would remember long after the verdict was delivered. He took the stand on the 9th day, a small figure in the witness box, who looked even younger than his 12 years against the dark wood and formal trappings of the court, and he answered Claire's questions in a clear, steady voice that carried to every corner of the room. He told them about his grandmother, about the life she had lived in the mountain cabin, and the poverty she had endured, and the fear that had shadowed her every day, and he described finding the hidden compartment and the documents, and learning the truth about who she had been and what had been taken from her. Then Claire handed him a bundle of letters, the ones his grandmother had written over the years to friends and to herself, letters she had never sent but had kept as a record of her thoughts and her sorrows, and she asked him to read from them so the jury could hear Eliza's voice. Samuel's hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the fragile pages, but his voice was steady as he read his grandmother's words aloud, her descriptions of the fear that never left her, and the dreams she still had of the home that was stolen, and the love she bore for the grandson she was raising in hiding, and her hope that someday the truth would be known. The courtroom was utterly silent as he read, the jurors leaning forward in their seats, several of them wiping tears from their eyes, as Eliza Whitmore spoke to them from beyond the grave through the voice of the boy she had raised. When Samuel finished and stepped down from the witness stand, he saw that even some of the defense attorneys were looking away, unable to meet his eyes. Claire delivered her closing argument the next day, standing before the jury and speaking of justice delayed, but not denied, of a woman who had been robbed not just of money, but of her entire life, and who had died still waiting for the world to acknowledge what had been done to her. She spoke of Samuel's courage in coming forward, and the community that had protected him, and the responsibility that the jury now held to finally set right a wrong that had stood for 60 years. When she finished, the silence in the courtroom was so complete that Samuel could hear his own heartbeat, and he knew that whatever the verdict, his grandmother's story had finally been heard. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours, a speed that Claire told Samuel was almost unheard of in a case of this complexity, and that could only mean that they had found the evidence overwhelming and the conclusion obvious. Samuel sat in the courtroom waiting for them to return, his hands folded in his lap and his eyes fixed on the door through which they would enter, and he thought about his grandmother and the 60 years she had spent waiting for a justice that never came. When the jury filed back in and took their seats, their faces were solemn, but several of them looked directly at Samuel with expressions that gave him hope, and he gripped the edge of the table as the foreman stood to deliver the verdict. The words came in formal legal language that the judge read aloud, but their meaning was clear and unambiguous. The jury found in favor of the plaintiff on all counts, ruling that Eliza Whitmore had been the rightful heir to the estate of Cornelius Whitmore, that she had been defrauded of her inheritance through forgery and conspiracy, and that full restitution of the estate, plus substantial damages, was to be awarded to her sole surviving heir, Samuel. The number the judge read was so large that Samuel could not fully comprehend it, a fortune built over generations and grown through decades of investment, now legally and rightfully his. He heard Claire exhale beside him and felt her hand grip his shoulder, and he saw the defense attorneys gathering their papers with the tight expressions of people who had lost completely and knew that appeals would be futile. The judge spoke further about the gravity of the case and the courage of those who had come forward, and he announced that Gerald Whitmore would face additional criminal charges, including conspiracy to commit murder, based on evidence uncovered during the investigation, charges that would almost certainly result in significant prison time. The 60-year injustice against Eliza Whitmore was officially recognized and rectified in that wood-paneled courtroom, her name cleared and her claim validated, and her stolen life finally acknowledged by the law that had failed her for so long. When the proceedings concluded, and the gallery erupted in murmurs, and the reporters rushed to file their stories, Samuel stood slowly from the plaintiff's table and walked toward the courthouse doors. Claire walked beside him, and Martha, who had made the long trip to Richmond to be present for the verdict, took his other arm. He pushed open the heavy doors and stepped out into the afternoon sunlight, the January air cold, but the sun bright on his face. And he stood on the courthouse steps looking out at a world that had suddenly changed in ways he was only beginning to understand. He was no longer a poor mountain boy, with nothing but a crumbling cabin and his grandmother's memory. He was free, truly free, the heir to a fortune, and the bearer of a truth that had finally been told. The drive back to the mountain felt different than any journey Samuel had made before, the familiar roads and ridges unchanged, but his place in the world transformed in ways that he was still struggling to comprehend. Claire drove him home the day after the verdict, the same dusty silver car climbing the same rutted tracks. But now Samuel looked out at the passing forest with the knowledge that he could buy these mountains 100 times over and still have money left, a thought so strange and overwhelming that it seemed to belong to someone else's life rather than his own. When they rounded the final bend and the clearing came into view, Samuel saw something that made his throat tighten and his eyes burn with tears he did not try to hide. They were all there waiting for him. Martha standing in front with her arms open, and behind her, Tom Sutter and the Crawford brothers, and old Mrs. Patterson in her wheelchair, and a dozen other families who had kept watch over his cabin and protected him through the dangerous weeks when Gerald Whitmore's threats had hung over him like a storm cloud. They began to clap when he stepped out of the car, a sound that started soft and grew until it echoed off the ridges, and Martha pulled him into an embrace that smelled of wood smoke and herbs, and felt like home in a way that no mansion or fortune ever could. These were the people who had stood with him when he had nothing, who had honored his grandmother's memory by sheltering her grandson. And Samuel understood as he looked at their weathered faces and work-hardened hands that they were his true inheritance, more valuable than any amount of money. He spoke to them in a voice that shook with emotion, thanking them for what they had done, and telling them that he would never forget it, and he made a vow that he would use the fortune he had reclaimed, not to leave this place, but to honor it, not to become someone new, but to remain who his grandmother had raised him to be. The money would change his life in ways he could not yet imagine, would open doors and create possibilities that a poor mountain boy could never have dreamed of. But it would not change who he was or where he belonged. He was Samuel, Eliza Whitmore's grandson, a child of these mountains and these people, and he would stay connected to his roots no matter how far the fortune might allow him to reach. Martha squeezed his hand and told him that his grandmother would be proud, and Samuel looked up at the blue ridges rising against the sky and believed that she was watching and that she knew. The spring came slowly to the mountains that year, the snow retreating up the ridges in stages, and the first green shoots pushing through the brown carpet of last year's leaves, and by the time the dogwoods bloomed white against the dark forest, Samuel had transformed the cabin into something his grandmother would have recognized, and something she never could have imagined. He had kept the original structure, the log walls, and the stone fireplace, and the tin roof that sang in the rain, because these things were part of her, and part of him, and no amount of money could improve upon their meaning. But he had also made it whole in ways it had never been, replacing the rotted boards and sealing the cracks and installing proper windows that kept out the cold, and a new wood stove that heated every corner, and plumbing that brought running water into the kitchen for the first time in the cabin's long history. He had added a room onto the back where he could sleep without climbing a ladder, and he had built a proper porch that did not sag, and he had run electricity up from the valley so that he could read at night without straining his eyes by candlelight. The cabin was a real home now, warm and solid and comfortable, but it remained humble in its character and modest in its size, because Samuel had no desire to live in a mansion and no need to display his wealth to the world. The fortune he had inherited was vast, more than he could spend in 10 lifetimes, and he had thought long and hard about what his grandmother would have wanted him to do with it. The answer had come to him one night as he sat on the new porch looking out at the stars, remembering all the times Eliza had helped her neighbors, with nothing to give but her time and her kindness and her refusal to let anyone suffer alone. He had established a trust in her name, the Eliza Whitmore Foundation, and he had funded it with enough money to operate forever, and its purpose was simple and direct, to help mountain families in need. The foundation paid medical bills for people who could not afford treatment, and bought school supplies for children whose parents had nothing, and delivered heating oil in winter to cabins where the old and the poor would otherwise freeze. It asked for nothing in return, and attached no conditions, and operated with the same quiet generosity that had defined his grandmother's life. And already in its first months, it had helped dozens of families in the hollows and valleys that had been her home. On a warm afternoon in May, Samuel walked up the ridge to the cemetery where his grandmother was buried, carrying a bunch of wildflowers he had picked from the meadow below the cabin. He knelt by her grave and laid the flowers against the simple stone marker that bore her name and the dates of her birth and death, and he talked to her as he often did, telling her about the foundation and the families it was helping, and the way people spoke her name now with respect and gratitude instead of pity. He told her about the trial and the verdict, and Gerald Whitmore's conviction, about Dorothy Marsh's testimony, and Claire Ashford's tireless work, and the community that had protected him when he needed it most. And then he told her the thing he had come to say, the thing that mattered more than all the rest. He told her that the walls had finally told their story, that the documents she had hidden and protected for 60 years had done what she always hoped they would do, and that the world had listened and believed and delivered the justice she had been denied in life. He sat by her grave until the sun began to sink toward the ridges, and the light turned golden in the trees, and then he rose and walked back down the mountain to the cabin that was his home, carrying her memory with him, like a light that would never go out. Samuel stood on the porch of his rebuilt cabin, in the golden light of a summer evening, his hands resting on the smooth new railing that he had sanded and finished himself, and he looked out at the blue-ridged mountains that rolled away to the horizon, like waves frozen in stone. The air was soft and warm, and carried the scent of pine and wildflowers, and the distant promise of rain. And the only sounds were the whisper of the breeze through the trees and the call of a thrush somewhere in the hollow below. He was 13 now, his birthday having passed quietly a few weeks before, with a small gathering at Martha's cabin, and a cake she had baked herself. And he stood a little taller than he had a year ago, and his face had lost some of its childish softness, but his eyes were the same sharp blue they had always been, watchful and thoughtful, and holding depths that belied his years. He thought about his grandmother as he stood there, as he did every evening when the light turned gold, and the mountains seemed to glow with an inner fire, and he marveled at the courage it must have taken for her to flee everything she knew, and build a life of hiding in these remote hollows. She had sacrificed wealth and comfort, and the world she had been born into, had lived for 60 years in poverty and fear, and she had done it all to protect a truth that she believed would matter someday, a truth that she had preserved against all odds and passed on to him. He understood now that the inheritance she had left him was not really the money or the estate, or even the documents hidden behind the wood stove, but something far more valuable and enduring. The knowledge that truth was worth protecting, and justice was worth fighting for, and that one person's courage could change the world, even if it took generations to see the result. He was no longer just a poor mountain boy, with calloused hands and patched clothes, no longer the orphan that people looked at with pity, and the assumption that his life would be small and hard and forgotten. He was the keeper of a truth that would not stay buried, the heir to a legacy of integrity and sacrifice, and the founder of a foundation that would carry his grandmother's kindness forward into generations she would never see. But more than all of that, more than the money and the recognition and the justice that had finally been done, he was home. He was standing on land that his grandmother had loved and protected, surrounded by mountains that had sheltered her and a community that had honored her memory, and he knew that this was where he belonged and where he would stay. The truth had been told, the wrong had been righted, and Eliza Whitmore's grandson was finally, fully, at peace.